And we are going. We are live. Welcome, guys. Today we're going to be talking about affection and friendship from C.S. Lewis's The Four Loves. Uh, Today I have with me Noah, Landon, and Luke. Noah, if you'd like to go ahead and kick off a synopsis of the two types of love we're going to talk about today.
Yeah, so like James said, we're going to be going over the two loves that he first describes being affection and friendship. Uh, First of all, being affection, which he describes as the lowest of the loves. It's the love that we as humans share with the beasts, in that sense, because affection is familial, not brotherly, because brotherly would be more like friendship, but familial in that there's a relationship with a mother or with a nurturer or with just nurturer in general. Um, and at the same time, it's also affection's like a very subtle love that it's lower. It's not as intimate as friendship or connected as friendship, but it is. It's something that you share with. It's something that you share with, say, someone you see every day at a train station, at the same time every day, and over time you develop like a relationship with them. That's kind of that's like a metaphor that I came upon in reading this section, and it's very interesting the way how he describes it. And if any of you have any like ideas with the opening chapter of affection, um, that'd be a good way to kind of go further into this, because he starts off with talking about um, like a relationship between a mother and a son, or a mother and daughter, and like the affection that's developed between the two.
Hmm. Well, I thought it was interesting because he effectively was saying that it was like a universal love.
Mm-hmm.
Like you said, we share it with the animals. Like even dogs and cats uh, can feel like a sense of affection. Um, so in that way, they can kind of reciprocate affection with you. Um, if you have like a pet, for example. Um, I I think it's interesting in that way because that kind of has the implication that it might be like a biological imperative, I guess. I don't know if imperative is the right word for that. Um, but it's like a biological based uh, love. It seems very much more driven by probably like brain chemistry,
Well, I
more
think
so, or like very simple brain chemistry.
it ties in. Well, I think this love ties into the findings that a baby will die if it isn't held. It can be fed properly and it can be given proper rest, but if it's not, um, there's not like that affectionate aspect of like integrated into the life of the offspring, then it literally dies. I don't know the specific studies, but I know that they conducted them in England in some point in the late 20th century. Um,
Yeah, it was in an orphanage. They didn't have enough staff to hold each child, and a bunch of the ones that weren't held as often died off.
right.
Hmm.
That's great. That's a really good
Isn't
point.
yeah, isn't that like need love though? Uh
Um,
type of
Well, he
need
talks
love.
about affection as both need love and gift love. The quotes:
Okay.
"It is need love, but what it needs is to give. It is gift love, but it needs to be needed."
mhm.
The quote. Yeah.
Right.
So it's yeah, it is. I think strictly biological because um it's kind of like if you're getting like attacked by a predator, and you go into shock and you can't fight back, like your body will just shut down like your pain response because it knows you're screwed. It's kind of the same deal as like if you're born and you don't have uh someone to take care of you, then your body just shuts off, because like you're not going to be able to survive the next few years fending for yourself as a child.
Mm.
Mhm.
And it's like that with all mammals, at least.
Mm. Well, see, I find it interesting because he also says that like you can feel affection towards people that you don't necessarily like. Um, and I think the example he gave was like a mean neighbor that you've known for all your life. Um, and they may be mean, but at least you know them.
I thought it was cool how he talked about how like you can kind of gauge how affectionate you are with someone by how like mean you can be, kind of. Like if you have a really good friend, you can both just talk shit to each other and you both know that it's being spoken about out of love, and it changes from hate into humor.
Hmm.
I thought that was a really cool point that he made, is like you like if your family is just being like super polite, like there's something kind of off.
Yeah.
You should like talk shit to each other um and be mean to an extent, but everyone there is in, so it heightens the love, actually.
Yeah. Um,
Because I know that what you were just talking about, Landon, and I'd like to talk more about this later, because I know it's in like the later part of the chapter where he talks about um, certain manners being allocated to different environments, like whether you're in private or in public, uh, and like affection. In affection, there's like I guess it could be pathologized, but uh, in proper affectionate love, that same affection that's displayed publicly has its own form, in your house, with you know with family, um, and we can hash that out more as we get to it. But yeah, he said that in like the close in the first pages that that it's interesting because it's the humblest and it often goes unnoticed. Uh, you don't notice when it's formed; it just comes into being uh,
mm.
over time. I wonder if you guys have any thoughts on that.
Well, it was like what he was talking about with the example of gin, where gin is a drink in itself, but it's also the base for a lot of other drinks. Like to have a more um, complex form of love, affection has to be present as kind of like baseline, and then you can build on top of it.
Mm. Also, he was saying that like you don't want to try and force it out into public, I guess, because and the example he gave was like moving your furniture out of your house. Sure, it was nice and private, but in public, it just looks kind of shoddy.
Yeah.
um,
The pictures he paints using these metaphors, it really helps you kind of like, because like when you're talking about like emotion as we are, you can't really use rational language as well. Like you have to use some kind of metaphor to actually induce the feeling, so everyone's on the same like emotional uh,
mhm,
page, as opposed to just the same like analytic page.
mhm. I think it's funny because he says that that affection has a homely face, which
Yeah,
I found that very interesting or very funny.
It's like with Eros, like public displays of affection make everyone uncomfortable. Like you like stay in private doing that. Like don't take it out into public.
Hmm. Um,
and like you said with the metaphor of gin, Landon, he also talked about how like that base that kind of can mix with other drinks and come to make different flavors of different drinks. He talked about how affection uh, can come into other forms of love and flavor them in such a way, give them their own uniqueness and distinct uh, aspects that make them more pleasing.
Mm.
So it's interesting how they can intermingle, how affection can intermingle with other things.
Yeah. See, I'm curious because he talks about like the mixing of the different loves, and I'm curious how he imagines that. Is that like a single act can have kind of the feeling of two different types of love, or you feel the two different types of love for a specific person, but your actions are separate, like per type of love. Because I think later on in the chapter he does talk about um, like shared actions between the different types of friendship, or not
Mm,
friendship, love. So it's like eros and affection. He says kissing is one example.
mm,
There is definitely like an eros based kiss, and then there's also an affection based kiss. But I don't know if he necessarily draws a line in there, or if it's just kind of merged together as this mix of the different types of love. And then the other one that he said, can't quite remember. Um, it was a kiss and also baby talk. Um, so like with affection, like parents will baby talk their children, but then also between lovers, you will have like baby talk. Um,
Mm.
so
mm.
I'm kind of curious about how that mix is kind of how it happens, or how it's envisioned, or like uh, how you theorize it, if that makes sense.
It kind of ties into like Freudian psychoanalysis a little bit, doesn't it?
Yeah, I mean it's yeah, because I guess effectively everything boils down to, I mean, well, I'm not sure because I don't know enough about Freud, but the very base understanding that I have is that everything kind of boils down to effectively eros. But I don't know if that almost seems to be kind of the opposite of what's being said here. Is like the base of everything is like affection, and you kind of mix in other things.
Right.
Mhm. Yeah, I think that's more appropriate too because I don't think you can get eros. I don't think you can have proper like romantic, intimacy with another that without first experiencing like familial affection, without
Mhm.
first like experience like that's something I've learned a lot in the body-based psychotherapist I told you about with Lowen and Wilhelm Reich, is that they talk about, or Lowen. I've read more Lowen. I haven't really read Reich, but Lowen, he kind of talked about this in one of his books where, you know, in order to more like fully integrate and to fully express something like, the act, what you partake in the act of sex, it's, you have to first understand or experience and know like trust and like a familial intimacy, and to know like and to be comfortable with like a touch, like a caring touch, and not necessarily a sensual or a sexual touch.
Yeah, I think he kind of touches on that here in the affection chapter. I think he plans on talking about it more in the eros chapter, but I think the rough, uh, like the rough feel of what he's saying with that is that a marriage that's based solely on eros won't last very long, because eros is kind of uh, it's a very fleeting type of love if you don't have something to ground it.
Yeah. It's yeah, because like we're not just, like you said, like we share a lot of characteristics with animals, but we're not just animals. Like we have this deep-seated need for intimate relationships beyond physical. And so if it's based solely on that, it won't work out for
Mhm.
very long.
Yeah.
You need um, you need that other component uh, of like psychological affection, and what's the word I'm looking for? Like emotional connection.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, but going back to what you asked originally, James, I think that you never get. I don't think you can ever get the thing in itself. So I mean, in this particular scenario, I don't think that you can get the. In any scenario, you don't ever get the pure. I think they are all mixed together in some varying levels, degrees. So that was just kind of just to answer your question earlier.
Yeah.
I think that in any action, like say an affectionate kiss or a romantic kiss, there are one or the other are slightly are there, but again in varying degrees, but there's always that remnant of the other.
Mm-hmm. So another thing that I kind of thought about reading through this, at least like the first two, and kind of like imagining what he's going to say about like the next two after that. Um, Affection to me seems to be a much more slow forming love. It's something that takes time to build up, but it's also kind of uh, like actions that are based on it are kind of like small gestures, right? It's like it's very small, slow build up versus Eros, um, or at least what I kind of imagine Eros is. He may flip my head on this with his description later. But Eros seems to be more of like a fast paced, like big gesture. You want romantic. Um, it kind of, in that sense, is juxtaposed against affection. Because when I think Eros, I think like romance. I think big gestures. When I think affection, I think uh, like small gestures, kind of like building up over time.
I would disagree a little bit. I think that affection is necessary immediately, like especially with family. And I mean, if you wouldn't have the opportunity to form a friendship or like an eros relationship unless affection was present from the start, which wouldn't bother. Um,
Mm.
it kind of has to be there first, and then you build on top of it slowly.
See, I'm not sure about that because like I mean the example that comes to mind is like a one night stand, right? So like Eros in that case is, even if it's in a like a corrupted form, is still present, but you don't necessarily have an affection towards the person. Um, and
Mm-hmm.
because
Well,
the other reason why I kind of say that affection is like a slow forming love is because he says that by the time you realize it's there, it's already been there for like a while. You don't ever, you typically don't think like, oh, I'm starting an affection now. It's something that's been going on for a while, and you say like, oh, I have this like deep affectionate love for this person.
well, I would argue that it's been going on from the very start, like whether or not you noticed it or not. Like that's a
Oh
different
yeah,
story.
yeah, no, I agree with that. And
Immediate.
I'm not saying. So I guess the difference between, I think there's a difference between the way we're envisioning it. Are you kind of picturing affection as like an endpoint? Like it's something that you reach up to? Because I envision affection as like the journey in a sense, not necessarily the goal.
I
It's the things that you do along the way.
I'm envisioning affection as something that is like the reason behind any friendship. Like um, it's the thing that you experience at the very beginning that allows you to keep on speaking with that person in the future. Like if you just, it's like you say, like getting off on the right foot with someone.
Yeah.
Like a good impression incites affection immediately. You can build on it and it grows, but it's there as like kind of the base of the drink, like talking about. Like you don't. Yeah.
What is
Well, I agree with that. Sorry, go ahead, Luke.
so uh with affection, is affection also like if you know someone for a long time and you don't necessarily even like the person,
Mm-hmm.
like their quirks or their personality or whatever, but if you know them for long enough and you have a relationship with them for long enough, there's there is some sort of an affection that
Mm-hmm.
happens. Like I think he talks about this, like uh, knowing someone's old ways, or like that's just the same old so and so.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Well,
So that
it's
seems like a slow. That does seem like a slow growth sort of thing. That,
yeah.
yeah,
That's a.
Well, and that's the thing is like I kind of envision friendship as like a slow growing thing as well. I mean, it's probably on like a sliding scale, right? Affection is probably like the slowest from what I've understand. Friendship is probably not too much further down the scale. Eros is just in my understanding so far, Eros is just like much faster paced than friendship or affection. Um,
Well, so I think like the example you gave, Luke, of that's just the same old so and so. I think that's a measure of how much affection there is. Whereas like that kind of polite thing that you present to someone that you just met, where you're not quite on the same page enough to um, notice their quirks and still dislike them. That politeness is still affection. Because you're like I know you and there's enough affection for me to be polite to you as opposed to just kind of writing them off and never speaking to them again because you guys just don't jive well. But I think that there's degrees of affection, and I think eros would be um, it would take a while to build up, and then it would have that spike, right?
mm.
And then be like a decline afterwards. But if there's enough affection, it can survive that decline after the peak.
Well, see, I guess we have a disagreement there because I wouldn't necessarily consider someone being polite like a form of affection. And we can go into that if you want, but I think that's just like a fundamental disagreement there. As far as like Eros and like the kind of the pacing, I'm not sure if Eros has much of a buildup that you're thinking, because in my mind, it's like the stereotypical honeymoon phase. It's like it shoots up really quick and then it slowly starts to degrade over time. I mean, in some cases, it shoots up and then really rapidly shoots back down into nothing. Um, but I think that's partially why he's saying that it needs to be grounded in affection. It's because if you don't have something to renew that kind of like up and down of Eros, Eros is very like volatile. It seems like
Right.
if you don't have something to
It's very
ground
well.
it,
Yeah, you think of eros, it's a very it's one of like it's another biological or carnal form of love, much like affection. But like you said, eros, it's very yeah, it's very sporadic and it's very come and go. It's with the emotions. It's not with something that's willed necessarily. So you're right. It has to be grounded. So that's where you can kind of see how affection, the highest can't stand without the lowest. So that's kind of how you see where affection is like a foundation in that sense. So I kind of understood what you were saying, and I kind of agree with what Landon was saying, where like it develop affection can develop over time, but at the same time, in order it has to be there in order for anything else to more to come out of it.
mm-hmm,
You know what I mean? And over time, it can become affection become enriched,
mm-hmm,
and it become more nuanced with each person. But in some degree, it has to be there
mm-hmm.
first.
Yeah,
Well, so
I
I
think
guess
we're most being James.
yeah, I think we're very closely on the same page there. We're close to being on the almost exact same page. Um, but like because in my head, for example, affection is something that you can feel for a person without them being in the room, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
I mean, and I in a way, I think you can do that with all of these, but it's the most likely uh, my thought at least to be the one that you're going to feel like outside of the room or with them outside of the room. Anyway,
One thing I want to run by you guys is this divulges a little bit into friendship, but it's kind of where affection and friendship combine, is kind of like looking at this from an evolutionary standpoint of like we spoke about how affection is a kind of a biological response from parent to offspring, and he argued in the chapter on friendship that there really wasn't a biological reason for friendship. But I would disagree on that. Is that there are showings of how there's like a symbiotic relationship between friends, which is why we converge into tribes as people. Like I help you, and in the future you help me. Therefore, we both have a reason, or we both have a higher likelihood of surviving and reproducing afterwards.
But I
You
think
get that it's that you could argue that like love is kind of just a chemical concoction, and that there's biological reasons for it, or do you think it's more of a spiritual thing that humans have this unique ability to form close bonds, and that because we have
so
this spirit backing
so
to it?
my kind of thought on that is, to me, that's where he would differentiate companionship from friendship. So what you described, where we come together as a society and we work together for like a common goal, that's companionship. But friendship is something that kind of grows out of companionship. So like as we work towards a common goal, if we have common pleasures and a common goal and we like each other, then out of that will grow a friendship. Because the example that he gives uh, is if you have like a companionship and you like go away for a year and you come back and you try to have a conversation with them, you're going to have like pleasantries for a few minutes, but then you're not going to have any like substance to talk about underneath that. And the conversation is going to end very quickly. Versus friendship, which he says that you could go away for 5 years, come back, and it'd be as if you had never left because
Yeah.
the friendship will just pick right back up.
So is friendship more like a shared appreciation love, would you say? It's like we share uh appreciation for something or interest in something.
well, he kind of talks about that with friendship, and which is in the next chair. He talks about how one aspect of friendship is there is that you both are friends. Lovers face each other, but friends stand next to each other because they're facing the same goals. And while you can have a lover who's a friend, and vice versa, uh, you, yeah, there is that idea of like a vision, like common interest between the two. So yeah, there is that like appreciation aspect to it.
Well, because the thing that comes to mind when you ask that question is he talked about the questions that a friend asks is never the question that a biographer would ask. Like they don't care if you're married, they don't care if you have children, they don't care what race you are, what they don't really care about you per se. They care about you within the context of like shared uh, goals or like shared pleasures or uh, friendships tend to, at least conversation within a friendship tends to revolve around the object of that friendship. Uh,
Right.
Right.
Like what I'm kind of looking to get into is like do you guys individually think of this as something that could be chalked up to biology? Because he gives the example of like a friend of his had a horse that was friends with a hen, and in zoos they'll give like cheetahs, they'll put a dog in there and the two will become friends. So and there's like affection between dogs and cats. So I guess what I'm going to ask is like, it like the reason that we have friends, is it could you explain it through evolution and science, or is this something that is purely like spiritual and kind of applicable?
Well,
See,
I don't think it's purely one or the other. I
mm,
think that there's some aspects of it that do give credence to like evolutionary advantages and development, but also in the same respect, I don't think that you can reduce the nature of friendship and the nature of the the sublimity of a shared experience, with a friend to be
Right.
something purely biological.
But
well,
the
so
he love points to God, which is kind of what he got into in the introduction. And so it's like, can you account for the fact that we form close relationships without also accounting for the fact that there is intelligent design in this? That it's not just we're not just doing everything in order to reproduce and survive, but we're doing it to enjoy it. And there's love, so there's got to be God, right?
well,
What do you guys?
so I would like to talk about that, but before we kind of, I think we kind of moved on a little bit. Uh,
Mhm.
I think there is like a subtle difference in our presuppositions on like the example that you gave. So for example, you talked about like putting a cheetah and a dog together and then becoming friends. I don't necessarily know if that's a friendship because that to me that seems like more of an affection between the two. Um, they may know each other, but I don't know if to me I think the distinction that he's making is that friendship is a distinctly human quality.
Right, because there's an example I think of when you say the cheetah and the dog. I think of like there's been uh, I've seen something where a tribe of baboons raised a straight or a feral dog. It's not they're not necessarily friends. It's more like they took on that affectionate nurture aspect of each other. They took on like as if the dog was one of them, but it wasn't. Yeah, it wasn't necessarily like a friendship.
But did they do that for like evolution and so in order to survive? Like kind of like how we uh, in our more tribal state of humanity took on wolves in order to protect us from predators and help us hunt? Or was it because like they loved that dog and they thought it was so cute that they had to have it? Like, what
Well,
do you
so
guys?
that's funny because that's actually exactly what I was going to ask you was, for example, pets. Do you consider, I don't know if you have any pets, but if you did, would you consider, for example, your dog your friend? Because
Hmm.
I don't necessarily think I would consider my dog my friend. I mean, yes, I
It's
love my dog. I have an affection towards my dog. Um, but
yeah.
I don't converse with my dog. I don't have like a deep, intimate
It
connection with my dog.
it seems like what you're arguing is that friendship has to have language in order to be true friendship.
In a sense, yeah, I think
Yeah,
that is like a big distinction.
Hmm. That's really interesting.
Because you have to have
Yeah,
like you have to have like a common thought space, and to do
mm,
that, you have to have language to reach that common thought space.
right. It's like objective proof that like we're both on the same page, and you can kind of like gauge how much. Because it's like with your dog, you can't really. Well, I guess a cat's a better example. Like you can't tell if the cat is just being nice to you because you feed it, you know.
Mm,
But with a
mhm.
friend, like we're both on the same page that like we're we were in a relationship together because we love each other, and if it's a close enough friend
mhm.
you can say that just flat out, but with like a dog you don't know.
Yeah, well,
Right.
I think it's funny that you bring that up again because again, he in the book he says at certain points like uh, you'll have times where you can help your friend, but you're not obliged to. And he says,
Yeah.
obviously you will help your friend, but you're not obliged to help them.
And you're
Which I
not
think is
thinking like, oh, well then, like later on this week, he'll help me move or whatever. You're just going like, no, dude, I love this guy. I'm gonna help him out. And if you were thinking next week I'm gonna cash in the favor, like it wouldn't really be a friendship. It would be more of like a work friend,
Mhm.
like you were earlier.
But I think it's funny as well because he also says that like an example he gives was you would help your friend with something, but you might not necessarily help. The example he gives was you may not spare the lives of an entire village for a single bottle of premium wine. Um, but, so like in the friendship, you'd be willing to sacrifice like a bottle of wine to help your friend.
Mhm.
But to people that are not your friends, you may not necessarily extend uh, that same act of kindness.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. I think going forward, just trying to move through this chapter of affection, I'm just looking through my notes here. I think that we can kind of relay that biological imperative, in affection, because he talks about how people expect to receive affection just for the fact of their existence,
Mm-hmm.
um, and it it's kind of like a harsh way of what he says, but it's like, he says like an unlovable person, um, they they may expect they may expect affection, but because they're unlovable in some sense, they have to change something about themselves if it's that, if they can't receive something so foundational to themselves.
Mm-hmm.
Do you remember what passage talking about, or like where exactly
Yeah,
I'm talking about?
because the example he gives is about Mr. Pontifex, which I've never read.
Mhm.
And then he also gives the example of a mother who, so it's a friend of his that's a mother, and he says that her daughter doesn't love her or doesn't have affection towards her, but she showers her with gifts and always listens to her. But then he kind of goes into it and says, well, the root of the problem there is that the gifts you give her are gifts that she doesn't want, and you don't actually listen to her. You're listening to her as one of two different types of like failures in communication. It was like um, either you listen to what they say and just play it off as like, oh, they're a child, or you get upset that they're saying it and just disregard it. Um, but effectively, like the reason why you wouldn't receive affection comes down to some character trait that you have.
Right. So like you can talk about like unconditional love, but I think it's probably more common to experience unconditional affection, especially in like a family setting.
Um,
Say that again, Landon.
Um, like it's like unconditional love is pretty rare, but
mhm.
you see unconditional affection in like a family setting where it's like you can like kind of like be not that likable like in a society, but at home like family that likes you. I might be straying from what James is getting at a little bit.
No, I mean I agree with you on that. I think that that is definitely a direction you can take it in because that is what I would assume most people are talking about when they say unconditional love. Um, the only thing that I would be cautious of is not trying to, so like with that, not implying that that love is universal and that it is universally deserved, for example. Um, I think what he's saying here is that you cannot assume that you just deserve love. You have to earn it in some sense.
Yeah, he quotes, I forgot who he quotes, but I wrote it down, says, if you want to be loved, be lovable. Um,
Mhm.
it's something that he says in the book.
What was that, Landon?
Oh, so I thought you froze. Do you guys agree with that statement that like love should be conditional?
Mm,
I think we might have gotten into this however many weeks back of like I don't really remember the entirety of the conversation, but it'd be interesting to pick up.
yeah. I mean, I don't
I'm
know.
not-
I mean, that's a hard question to answer because
I think if I were to trace it, I mean, through the lineage of a human's growth and development, I think that, as a child, as an infant being raised and nurtured, yes, I think because you're so unconscious and you're so dependent on others, in some sense, in that state of infancy, you kind of need to see love, you need to feel love, um, in order to further expound that later in your life to where you become like your own agent, and like, so then then you're responsible for your own actions. But I think at first there needs to be a certain sense from the parents and for that affectionate love. Um, did you guys agree with that?
yeah.
Yeah. Also interesting because like I mean you could debate this, but like spanking a kid is like that's obviously not love. Like you could argue that that's
Well,
aggression.
I
Hate.
don't know if I necessarily agree with that.
Right, that's what I'm saying. Like this is a good
So
like area
so
to do.
for example, my parents spanked me as a child,
Yeah.
and I, as a child, sure, I did not enjoy it, but now that I'm an adult,
Mhm.
I see the value in them disciplining me,
Right.
and
So in a way, like it's still love in that way, but it's like it's
yes,
hard to gauge
yes.
because like I don't know. It's like
Well, I think,
figure out how to
well,
phrase is like the is that could you define that as love because they're doing it with your best interest in mind, or is like that act in and of itself like obviously aggression, hate?
Well, so I think it depends on what you're trying to define here. If you're trying to define like the action as an action of unconditional love, then I think there's some room for that. If you're trying to define the feeling as unconditional love, and like you will always have that feeling towards that person, I'm not necessarily sure I agree with that because there's a lot of conditions. Like, for example, if your child does not only does your child hold every moral stance that you find objectionable, but say for example they've committed every everything that you find morally objectionable. Say that you've killed people, say that they've raped people. Do you think you could love your child if they rape someone? I mean,
Yeah, I don't. That's it's a hard question because it's like if I told you for 1 week you can only it's only love, unconditional love. That's it, right? And
mhm.
someone walked by at the street and they exhibited hate to you. You if you hit them, like you're out of the game. That wasn't unconditional love.
Mhm.
Um,
I mean, I
but like no
guess.
doing that, it's like that is like as a you should love your child unconditionally to
Mhm.
an extent.
Well, so I guess it comes down to intention, though. Like the
mhm,
intention of hitting someone can differ. So like I could
right,
hit you out of pure nonchalance, like I just want to hit you, or I could see that you're doing something I find morally objectionable, hit you and say, "Don't do that. It's morally objectionable." Um, and
right,
not only do I find it morally objectionable, but the rest of society does. And if you continue to do it, you will get in trouble. Um,
right. I mean, yeah, you could take that back to the example of the parents,
yeah.
disciplining their children. Yeah, they're disciplined. They're not. They could be disciplining them just for the sake of their own, anger and wanting to really
Mhm.
release that on the child. But there's also the aspect of disciplining the child to teach them of what is morally objectionable, or something that they need to abstain from doing. Again, um, yeah. Yeah, so I think that's where you could take that example.
But
Yeah,
it's
you
like
hit,
it's
you
like
love them.
where does the line lie between discipline and child abuse? I mean,
Yeah,
it's
Yeah.
hard to place that line. It's
yeah,
very contextual.
very objective, and it changes by generation too. Like
Yeah.
the generation before us, they got hit with belts, while we got like hit with it like by a hand, you know.
Oh, I got the
Um,
belt.
Yeah, it was just wise.
See, my parents got the switch. They had to go out to the yard, grab a switch, and if it broke in the middle, then they had to go out and pick another switch, and they had to start from the beginning. So
Oh man.
there's
that was,
like a psychological aspect to that.
yeah.
Yeah.
It's like you want to pick something that's small enough
Yeah,
that it's not going to hurt that bad, but big enough that it's not going to break.
What
Um,
what were we just what led us to this? I'm trying to remember what, because I had something that I was gonna ask or say. What were we talking about just before this?
uh,
uh,
additional love. I don't know what was before that.
Okay, conditional love, and then we talked about yeah, yes. I was just gonna say that with something like aggression, like something like disciplining your child physically. I think with anything like that, a child will be able to understand the love that a parent is the love out of which the parent is disciplining them, as long as it is coupled with expressing love, another scenario, expressing like warmth, and expressing care for them, and expressing joy for them in other scenarios, because if you're able to express that, then they'll be more understanding, or they'll understand, yeah, they'll understand more in the future that when you do discipline them, it's out of there's something that there's obviously something up there. It's not just that that's how they are being continually hitting you.
yeah. Well, see that to me that draws in like the child's understanding of it for this example. So like in the examples of discipline that I was talking about, so like spanking, for example, I knew that I
Mhm.
had done something wrong. Like I understood that it was my fault that I was being punished, but
Mhm.
not every child will understand that. It's like they may think that it's just an unjust world. They may not necessarily connect that together, and I don't think that that makes that action any less of an act of love.
Mhm.
It's
Yeah,
kind of
I
a
think.
extreme
Good.
example of like how you can talk shit to your friends because they know you love them. It's like the child has to know that their parent loves them, and then there will be, I think, like less psychological repercussions from getting, say, spanked.
Mm,
But if like the parents like a dick to their child, then the child's like, oh my god, I'm in a house with someone who hates me and is also abusive. But it's like
mm,
if it's like if there's love before that, it's like, okay, well then like this person is my friend. Like you kind of, this is a kind of an unconscious process that happens inside the child.
mm,
Right. It's kind of like a game of sorts. Um, Going and just kind of touching on James, what you were just saying. You're right. I think that you have to incorporate the child's own individual understanding of it. But I think more foundationally speaking, and this kind of reverts back to what I was talking about with like the body-based psychotherapy. I think that collectively, as humans being born into our bodies, I think that you'll only be that much more able, or that much more. It'll be only be that much more possible for a child to understand what is like right and wrong from their parents' discipline or love, based on their expressiveness of like their ability to hug their children, and to to express physical love as much as they are to express like physical love in the form of discipline,
mm.
if that makes any sense.
Well, so I think a big distinction uh, about like what I'm saying that might help people understand, that might help you guys kind of see how I picture it. Love is like two things, right? Love is a verb and love is a noun. You
Mhm.
can love people, you can do actions of love, but then you have a
Yeah.
feeling, and that feeling is love. So just because I act out of love does not mean that people will feel love for me. And that's the idea that you assume that you deserve affection from your child, but they don't
Yeah.
reciprocate affection towards you. Um, whereas, I mean, it's the same idea with punishment. Just because you punish your child doesn't mean that they will appreciate that you punish them. Um,
Right. And I'm not
there's kind
saying,
of
yeah,
like a
I wouldn't say
disconnect
that.
there. I
Yeah.
mean, I'm not saying that you are. To understand like what my thought is on the matter, I thought it was a good idea to differentiate that. Uh,
Yeah. Yeah. That's good. That's good. Um, let's see. Or going forward, kind of expounding upon that. We talked about how it can be something you expect to receive, and then he kind of gets into like the attires of affection, which is what we were talking about earlier. The like the different forms of affection you display between public and private settings, and he says like each is they're right in their own sense, or they're proper in their own sense. Like wearing dress clothes is not necessarily proper when you're in your house,
mm,
and just like wearing pajamas to a formal event is not proper.
mm,
In the same sense, those attitudes, those forms of affection, those forms of conversation that you have um, with different people, they have their own different clothes,
mm.
different flavors.
I think a metaphor that stuck out to me about this was he said that if you're at home, you can wear the same clothes twice, or you can wear them over and over again, but you don't want to wear them until they stink.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Like you
See,
have
I
to
didn't.
shower, you have to wash your clothes, you have to wear different clothes, but you're given like a degree of freedom to uh, not necessarily be lazy. Um, I don't really know what you would call that, but you're given like a sense of freedom. You're given some flexibility. If that makes
Yeah,
sense.
it's just like a lack of harsh judgment. It's like
Mm,
I yeah, I mean I wear the same sweatshirt a couple days in a row too. Whereas like I remember like in middle school and high school, it's like if you wore one shirt one week and then one that same shirt the next week, people would be kind of like, you wear that shirt a lot, and you'd hear that all the time. I don't know if it was your high school, it might have just been like annoying rich kids, but it's like you should have more clothes. Are you washing? Like it's like they're kind of looking for that jab.
yeah, kids can be fucking brutal. But I think that's where affection comes in though, because like affection would kind of be the opposite of that. They're gonna be less likely to judge you uh, if you wear the same clothes twice, for example.
Yeah, 'cause it's like yeah, like if your like mom says that to you, it's like, dude, you're the one buying my clothes. Like,
Yeah. Uh,
but yeah, that was another good example or another little picture that he painted.
mhm,
Like the leniency and the lack of judgment that comes along with affection. It kind of has to be there.
mhm. I I think that's probably one of my favorite parts about his writings is that he has such beautiful metaphors. They illustrate the point like perfectly. Um, let's see what else. So I think he kind of goes on from that to start outlining like where affection can go wrong. Um, and the first one that he starts out with is jealousy. And so an example he gives of that is if you have like if you like twins and they share all of the same interest up until a certain point, and then one of them starts to have an interest that the other one can't. There's like a form of jealousy there, and the one that can't will say, well, he's only doing that to be snotty, or he's only doing that because he thinks he's better than other people, and stuff like that. And so it forms like a corruption of the affection.
Yeah, it's interesting. Like that someone could be being to you because they're jealous, and that there's insecurities present is interesting. I and it's he said it with children, but I wonder if it's also like present in adults as well. Like less mature people that don't have interests of their own can kind of like shit on people who do.
Hmm.
I don't know. You guys run into that ever?
Yeah, I definitely think this occurs. Especially if you've known someone for a long time and you've known a certain version of that person, you've shared interests or whatever. When they start to change or move in a certain direction that's unfamiliar to you or you can't go along with
Hello?
them,
We can hear you, Lennon. Oh, might be dropped down a bit.
can you hear me?
I can
Yeah,
hear you.
you're
Luke.
good.
Okay.
Just shit out too.
When they start to move in an unfamiliar direction, it makes people very uncomfortable. I know this from friends that I had in high school, but now we've since, separated. And it, if one person hasn't changed and the other, or if one person has just become more of themselves and the other person has moved in new directions, it's like who are you?
Mm.
That sort of feeling, and people really don't like it, and they want you to stay what they know.
Yeah. Well, so, and that's the thing is like affection is kind of like the feeling of familiarity. So like, uh, as as humans, and I assume that this is the same with animals, we prefer things that we know to things that we don't know. And so if you go out and start acting in a way that I don't understand or I don't get that, and it's different than what I consciously recognize you as, then there starts to become like uh, I don't think cognitive dissonance is the word there because I think that's like an internal thing, but there's like a dissonance there between my perception of you and your actual reality. And so that starts to form uh, contention between the two of us.
Right, and there's also uh, there's a fear of superiority or
Mm,
inferiority. There's a fear that the other person might be becoming or think they are too good for you now.
mm.
I
Well, I
think
mean,
that a lot,
see, I think the perfect example for that is if you have like a bunch of friends that are for all intents and purposes, losers. They're not going anywhere with their lives. They don't want to go to college. If say you're in high school and all your friends don't want to go to college, but you want to go to college, that will start to form like a sense of jealousy between them because they will start to think like, oh, you want to be better than us, huh?
Yeah.
Type thing.
Right.
I think that's where you're going with that.
Yes. Yeah. Oh,
Yeah, it's like with
oh, go ahead.
yeah, I was just gonna add on to that. It's like um it's like an example of where, you're trying to like step out of that group and you're trying to, personally better yourself, but out of you're striving for more, those around you who you've surrounded yourself with will like they can now see like their lack of like drive and their lack of desire to like become better, and so they want to keep you down to their level. And
Mm-hmm.
it's like, yeah, that's one reason why it can become very uncomfortable for people.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and I think this might be one of the things that really separates affection from friendship, because I think when someone steps out of that crowd, um, which is going to dislike them for it, become jealous because of it,
Mm-hmm.
I think his friends then who share that new common interest or new common goal, that we turn to, because we can't necessarily keep those same old connections anymore. So you find people that have the same interests, have the same values.
Mhm.
You know, so you like you were saying, if you come from a group of people who don't necessarily want education, and then you go and get an education, well, you're only going to really find good relationships in people who want that same thing, who have that same interest.
I think this is why family relationships can turn pretty toxic if you don't come from like, I don't want to say good family because that sounds like very pretentious and stuff, but that's almost what it is. It's like if you have a family that's not very ambitious and you're ambitious, your family is going to try and drag you back down to their level as much as they can, and you have to like, that is the perfect example of when you need to get away from your family because your family is being toxic.
Well, he gives the example of, you take like the newborn, or you take the new Christian and who was raised in a family of atheists. There can become a lot of disconnect between those two there, uh, because of his or her newfound joy in their religion, and they might. I forgot exactly how he describes it, but he goes into saying how initially the family will write it off as being silly, all the while they can't, or they, all the while they're still, they can't reconcile their anger at the fact that they can't reconcile that person to themselves because they're not like that same familiar person they once knew.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Well, yeah, and then there's a question like, in that case, do they really care about that person as a person, as an individual, or is it just their comfort in the familiar?
Well, this is, yeah, I think what you're asking ties into what Lewis talks about in form of like affection being a gift and a need love, because he talks about, gift love, as a gift love, it must work towards its own abdication. So you take like a nurturing mother, for example, they have to be loving, to the point where they're willing to give up their mothering aspects once they're fully able to fend for themselves. So you're right in saying that at some point the love stems from wanting to see them become their own person, I guess.
Mm-hmm.
But then it's
Okay.
kind of, you can see the, what were you saying, Anna?
I said hello. Sorry, I'm back.
Oh, yeah.
Welcome back.
But you can see the difficulty in like that dynamic, given that, like we talked about earlier, where in one sense you want to see the person kind of becoming themselves, but in the same sense as like that parental figure, you're trying to work them towards the better in life. So it's kind of like, how do you balance that?
Well, I think an important thing to remember with this is that this is like a corrupted state of affection, like the jealousy is.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think that's just important to remember because like if you assume that jealousy is like a natural state of affection, then that will kind of affect your perception of affection as a whole.
Yeah.
Which is funny because he does kind of go into the idea that like these corruptions aren't necessarily a neuroses. So it's not necessarily like an unnatural state of the mind,
Mm-hmm.
just an unnatural state of the love. And the reason why he says that is because it's not necessarily something wrong with our mind that causes us to be jealous when other people do things that are worthy of being jealous of. It's just, it's effectively just sin. Like he says that sin is not necessarily a neuroses, unless, and then I think he says later on, if you were to call it a neuroses, the neuroses would be the fall of man, like, or the fallen state, uh, which I find interesting.
Yeah, that is yeah. He talks about how these, like, he says, I talk about these corrupted states because they're they're within everyone has experienced these feelings. So it's not necessarily like that only a select few who are very out of line experience such corrupted states, but it's present within all of humanity, and that's due to our fallen state.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. He talked about towards the end of the chapter. I just noted this down because I thought it was funny. He talks about how he talked about the overly bearing and caring mother. I forgot what her name was,
It's the
but
Oedipal mother.
oh no, yes, but he gave like a
Oh,
specific example of
gotcha.
of the woman. I forgot what family. Like
Actually,
it was the
just
woman who cared for the family, so she cared for them,
Miss Fidget.
tended to them so much. Say it again.
Miss Fidget.
Yeah, Miss Fidget. She cared for them so much that like the love was corrupted in that sense because it was own like out of her own personal like fulfillment and not for again letting them or giving. It's not out of loving them, but he talks about how in these corrupted states there's pleasures of resentment, which really reminded me of like Dostoevsky's character from Notes from Underground. You could easily see how I forgot. There's some passage in Notes from Underground where he talked about, or he would do like he went to the dinner, like out of spite, like he got pleasure just for like there's a pleasure in him doing something just to be resentful about it.
Mm.
And how
I
does
thought,
that Miss Fidget?
oh, it wasn't but he just explained this during like that example, but I just when he talked about people will do things out of their own personal resentment, like
Oh,
have pleasure like out of their own personal resentment, and
Mm.
that just reminded me of Dostoevsky Underground Man.
Mm.
Yeah, and you could, I mean, you could see how people rationalize bad behavior to themselves. Um, like if you have someone close to you, and you could easily, and I think this is what he's talking about, you could easily treat them poorly out of resentment, but say you're doing it for their best interests. Um, like you could say, "Oh, I'm cooking meals for my children because it's their best interest," but actually you're doing it because you don't want to see them grow and flourish. You don't want to abdicate your motherhood. You don't want to see them grow beyond you.
Mm.
That's like that pernicious Oedipal affection.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, on like the other like far end of that, like when you lash out in anger, there's like a good feeling at first. I don't know if you like there's like something like nice about like a negative emotion, or like having like self-pity.
Mm-hmm.
There's almost like a nice experience that goes along with indulging that negative behavior.
Mm. Especially in the case where it also punishes the people around you.
Yeah, exactly.
You get to share that feeling with them.
Ground about how like moaning because of a toothache, so it like everyone has to experience your suffering too.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah.
um, let's see. I'm trying to think. Is there anything else that you guys have about like affection? Because I think that covers most of it.
Yeah, I think we got about everything we could there. I think we're ready to move on.
I will say, so actually, just looking at it real quick, I think the very end of the chapter, the last sentence, is a very good sentence. love, having become a god, becomes a demon. Just to tie that back in with, I think, the first chapter.
Yep. He also said that all forms of love carry within them the seed of hatred.
Mm-hmm.
So it's like that yin and yang. There's always one and the other. You can't have the thing in itself.
Mm-hmm.
So can we, before we move on, can we just expand on that a little bit more? That love carries within it the seed of hatred. Um, is that because it is that because of the possessive, the fact that that love could become possessive and um, threaten to like threaten the object of the love? I don't know. How do you guys think of that?
Well, see, there's a couple of reasons. One, love tends to lead to building idols um, that become like points of worship in a way. There's also the idea that it can lead to cognitive dissonance. So um, the reality of a love between you and another person may be different than the perceived love that you had in your head. And this is actually something that Noah and I kind of talked about before the call. Was like if you have like a romantic fantasy, for example, um, the reality of love won't necessarily live up to that fantasy. And so, because there's that little gap, there's room for people to get uh, upset or feel betrayed by reality or betrayed by their lover or et cetera, et cetera. I think those are the two big ones that I can think of. I don't know if you guys have any other.
Yeah. I guess just because love carries within itself its own capacity for self-destruction. It possesses, it can only destroy itself. It's like a diamond can only another diamond can break a diamond. It's like, and so him talking about like these corrupted forms of love, these loves being untrammeled by God, by something higher. If they become the God, then they become a demon. So it's like a matter of like knowing where your ideals are. Like, what are your ideals, I guess.
Gotcha. That makes sense. And what you guys were saying reminded me of those instances where a lover kills the other lover because they become jealous and they justify it by saying, if I can't have this person, then nobody can, or something like
Right.
that.
Right. Yeah, that's a good example. Exactly.
All right. Well, do we want to move on to friendship then?
Yeah, sounds good. So I liked the fact that he kind of started out the chapter by saying that if you're talking about affection or eros, people will listen to you. But if you start talking about friendship as like a type of love, they'll assume that you're talking about like being homosexual or something along those lines.
Yeah.
I thought that was pretty funny.
Yeah, because we go from like the lowest form of love in Lewis's terms to what he says is the most spiritual love, because there's no biological imperative here. It's the least natural of the loves, and he also talks about there's a disconnect between us and between the modern world and the ancient world, in that this friendship is not as valued as it once was, which I think it's true. I think in reading something like the Epic of Gilgamesh, for example, such an ancient text, you see like the value that the Sumerians placed on friendship, between Gilgamesh and Enkidu. It's like that was something that's long been a value in many cultures, but yeah, nowadays friendship is still a necessity, and it's still very much esteemed in a positive light, but just not as highly as it once was, and not as it's not as sacred, I guess.
Well, see, I find it interesting because there's kind of a juxtaposition there. So like the ideal of friendship, it's like the concept of friendship is uh, generally very positive. People like it, but actual groups of friends, as he says later on in the chapter, are kind of frowned upon. Like every term that you have for like a group of friends is like a gang or a posse or whatever. It generally has negative connotations. Um, because it eventually becomes like that friend group versus the world in a sense.
Right. And that's like one of the corruption aspects he gets into, where it becomes like friendships become purely exclusive just for exclusivity's sake. They thrive on their exclusive nature, which is what he talks about later. It's like they lose their vision, their what they once, their common interests, and now they simply seek to like establish a sort of superiority over others for the sake of like their friendship, or just because of their friendship.
Mm-hmm.
Right, and it's funny because at the same time he says that something like true friendship is richer the more people who share in it.
Mm-hmm.
Like, there are limitations to how many people can share in it, just practical limitations, but uh, like three true friends are better than two, that sort of
Mm-hmm.
thing. But then yeah, it can become corrupted where people just want to claim superiority, and that's no good.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
And I don't. Well, see, because here's the thing: is I don't necessarily think that like a sense of exclusivity ultimately leads to it being like corrupted. Because like you can have, I think there's probably a fine line there. You can have an exclusive friendship between like a group of friends and have it kind of juxtaposed to the rest of uh, the social circle without it being corruptive in quality, if that makes sense.
Yeah, definitely.
Um,
I think it's got to be exclusive to some degree. Uh,
Mhm.
but yeah, like I think Noah, you said this. It's or I forget who said it, but it's a fine line. It's just a fine line.
mhm.
Mhm. Right.
Yeah. Well, because the thing is, I think, especially given the idea of like temperament of people when it comes to introversion and extroversion, I mean, exclusivity is like really big for introverts. Like, you have to choose who your friends are going to be because you can't be friends with everyone. Um,
Yeah.
so,
Yeah. And kind of going on my notes here, like what you said, what you said, Luke. Um, friendships, the more the merrier. Essentially, it's like and the reason for that is because I thought it was a pretty cool idea. I never thought about this before, but I mean, it's true. Looking at my own friendships, is that with each friend that you have, um, each person like reveals a different aspect of a friend that you personally cannot evoke from that person. So, like, it's an ABC friendship. You know, A can only reveal like C. You can't see how B reveals C. You can only see how A reveals C, and it's just like it's interesting in that sense because you can kind of see like the richness of your friends' personalities.
mm,
Yeah, yeah, I can definitely relate to that. Um, like when when you have a friendship with one person, and then uh, it's really pleasant to have a good friendship with one person because like he was saying, it's he said like the question that starts a friendship is something like, "Oh, you too?" You're interested, or you know this thing too, or you're interested in this too, and that's a great start to a relationship. And then when the two of you discover someone else who also is can be part of that group, it just makes it even better. And then what you were saying, you're absolutely right. You just get all these great dynamics between multiple people, see different parts of them.
So what do you guys? So he goes on from that to start talking about the friendships between the sexes. So like men to men friendships, female to female friendships, and then man to female friendships. Like where's your guys? What's your guys' stance on that?
Well, I liked how he talked about in tribal communities going off with your male friends and being away from the women and the children, and like how that kind of, like Luke was talking about, how you see different aspects of each friend. You see kind of like the masculine energy multiplied, and you all just dive in this masculine energy, and then it's like, you know that the women are off doing the same thing, but you don't care what they're doing. It's like, that's their thing. We're over in our thing. In a similar way, children act differently in front of their parents and like in front of their siblings than they do over with a group of their own children the same age. It was just like interesting to look at it in that light.
Well, see, I thought he kind of hit the nail on the head, because he said that like between the sexes, it shouldn't be taken as a generalization that men and women won't be friends, but like on an individual level, that's just the way it tends to be. So you shouldn't necessarily say like no male can be friends with no female, but like as it actually plays out in reality, that just tends to be the way that it is.
Right.
And
It just, yeah, like I think, yeah, I mean, it just depends on the and he talks about this. It depends on like the nature of the man or woman's interests. If they don't, if you don't have, it comes down to that, because regardless of the sex, it's man or woman. If you don't share interests, then like friendship is very unlikely to develop between the two.
Was
A
it
very
also,
masculine. Sorry.
I was just gonna say, he also says it comes down to society as well.
Okay. Yeah. Exactly. Because like a very masculine man or a very masculine woman can't really be can't really be a friend with a very feminine woman or a very feminine man. There has to be like they have to have a vision of sorts of like what it is they want to accomplish, or perhaps their own similar pleasures in life, like what they work towards essentially. So yeah, I think he's right in saying that they can be friends, but it typically works out that it doesn't. That it doesn't usually. It's not the majority.
Right. And we've also got the problem, which happens more often than not, of which he mentions, the friend zone, where either the man or the woman perceives friendship love as eros love, and as we all know, that ends in disaster. So
Most of the times, yes.
Yeah, so that's a big barrier. That's a big barrier.
It says it's also down to education as well. So like in societies where either women aren't educated or women are educated differently, friendship tends to not be there, just because they don't have common understanding. I mean, it really comes down to common understanding for a lot of it.
Yeah, I mean, if you were to think of traditional hunter-gatherer societies, like with men, congregating for hunting and war continuously, they're not going to, they're like the interests are going to be separate from the women. They're it's the two different, totally different visions and totally different goals in mind. They can be lovers, their eros can be there, but friendship not as much.
Mm-hmm. Let's see. I find it interesting because, like, I don't know if he necessarily says this in the book, but one of the kind of barriers that I kind of perceive to like true friendship love is like the willingness to sacrifice for that friend. So like, for example, like my best friend, I would take a bullet for my best friend. Like that is like the level of seriousness that you can have in a friendship. If that makes sense.
Right.
But I think it would be more to do that for a spouse or children than for just a friend. I'm sure it exists both ways, but I'd say it's more common.
Yeah, I agree. Like, and I would even say that most cases, if it was like a choice between a friend and a spouse, you're going to choose your spouse. It's
Yeah.
just like, I just like, I don't want to, like, as we're talking about this, I don't want to boil friendship down to something that is like, I don't want it to be perceived as something that's, it's good for me, or it's good for both of us because it's good for me. Like,
Yeah.
there's like self-sacrifice in friendship.
Yeah. Yep. And also, in the I forgot what verses, but in the Bible it says, no one has a greater gift. Jesus says to the disciples that no one has a greater gift than this, that he would lay down his life for his friends.
Mm.
So it's not that he would lay down his life for his spouse, but it's that his friends. So you can see like the spiritual nature of love there, or of friendship there.
Jesus also has like a very long paragraph. I don't remember the specifics of it, but it's like it's essentially boils down to like if you went through life and you had everything but you didn't have love, like you're nothing. So that's the nice thing about Christianity, which is why I think C.S. Lewis is such a good person to write this book, because it's so centered around love in all of its forms.
Mm-hmm.
It's awesome.
So like thinking about it, I would be interested to go through and like compare Lewis's version of friendship against Nietzsche's version of friendship, because there's an entire chapter in Zarathustra where he talks about like the ideals of a good friend.
Really, that would be very interesting. What I mean, do you remember what the general ideas were, or like what he?
Not all of them off the top of my head. One that sticks out is like the type of friend that you don't feel obliged to, but you could take your armor off around them. You don't have to worry about them like stabbing you in the back.
Right.
It's like
Yeah,
there's just like a level of trust.
Yeah,
there.
I would say that's fair.
It's also like you don't pity your friends. A metaphor that Nietzsche used was that if you have to give help to your friend, make it the type of help that's like a hard candy, so that it's he has to work to get to like the goal. Like make it not necessarily difficult on him, but don't pity him. Like make him learn something from it, or make him a better person for it.
Yeah.
Yeah, like you could compare like the ideals of Zarathustra and the ideals of Jesus as kind of, like productivity and growth versus like rapture and appreciation of like the like true ideals of like a spiritual man that considers himself to be a child of God, and then someone like Zarathustra who would say we need to achieve godhood in and of itself.
Mm. Well, I don't know. I mean, there's some like subtleties there because, like, for example, Nietzsche tends to uh, expound on the importance of dance, for example, and music, and those don't necessarily further the goal of like reaching the Superman, but they're still important, if that makes sense.
Yeah,
Um,
that's um
Yeah, that's something. I mean, just on the topic of art and in general, something that Lewis says in this book about friendship is that, he says, like art and philosophy, it gives value to survival. It isn't an imperative; it's not a biological imperative, but it gives meaning and value, which is like something reminiscent of Nietzsche. It's like, art is, it's just as important as anything biological in that, there it gives it like a why.
mhm. Um, let's see. I do like his distinction between companionship and friendship. I think that was very succinct, and it was very poignant, very correct. Um, you can be companions to someone without necessarily being their friend. You can work towards a common goal without necessarily liking a person.
Yeah, yeah.
you could
I
have,
mean, a modern example of that would just be in the workplace.
yeah.
Hmm.
You're not necessarily, you're in the same, you're working towards the same goals, but you may not even know the person that you're
Hmm.
working with uh, outside of their job description.
Hmm.
Yeah, a symbiotic relationship in nature, which most likely like lacks love versus like a tribal and like a familial community.
Hmm.
Yeah, I think we covered a good bit of friendship as well. He says here, oh, he talks about with like attending to friends' affairs. He talks about how, you know, in he says perfect friendship, they'll help each other in times of need, but they the affairs they're tending to aren't desirable in themselves. Like, I'll go help you fight this war, but I'd much rather be tending to, we both much rather be tending to, our loves of whatever else our common interests,
Hmm.
rather than having to do this. But because you're my friend, I will do this.
Yeah, that instantly reminds me of certain people that I've encountered who they consider their friendships to be, there will be gossip circles of people who simply gossip about each other, and they try and they'll help each other to deal with gossip, and that ends up those affairs ends up occupying most of the time that they even spend together. It's like talking about what's going on in your life, what what are the people doing around you, what are the problems, that sort of thing. And it's just like this perpetual problem solving that I don't think they actually want to end, because that's the whole substance of the relationship.
Hmm.
And I do not think that's friendship in the way that he's describing.
Mm.
Because like that, friends will help you fight a war if it's necessary, but that's not the object of the friendship. You know,
Hmm.
if that makes
I
sense.
think that's a good measure of a friendship, but I don't think it's necessarily the object of a friendship. So I would agree with you there.
Right.
Um, I think as he wrapped up the chapter, he goes into the idea that friendship is like a spiritual reinforcement. So it will make a good man better and make a
Yeah.
bad man worse. Um, I found that to be really interesting.
That kind of jives with your definition of friendship from Zarathustra a little bit, where it's like a true friend promotes growth instead of just like if you and your like you would call like a toxic friendship something where like you guys get together and things get worse, like have a drug problem and you get together and kind of like reinforce that your drug use is okay because you're both doing it, or it's like you have two friends, all you do is play video games, and so it's like you using your friendship as an excuse to waste time. And but like a good friend would be you guys get together and you go to the gym and then you both leave having solved each other's problems.
Well, it's like that's one of the first things I think they tell you in AA is like get away from your friends. Like don't be
Yeah.
around the friends that you were around when you were drinking, because they'll just drag you back into it.
Yeah, one thing this is a little bit off topic, but the thing I really liked about the chapter was he said, Eros is naked bodies, friendship is naked personality.
That was
Great.
I like that a lot.
You're in front of someone and that person's love is like a container for you to show your true self. And it's a break from this bullshit thing that society enforces where you conform to the social norms. And if you do that, then you're likable. It's the break and the relief that you experience from being able to be who you actually are instead of wearing some sort of mask is instrumental in with mental health,
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I'm interested to see how.
Go
I was
ahead.
going to say, I'm interested to see how he will describe Eros or describe the confiding in a loved one that you typically see in Eros relationships. I wonder if he's going to say, well, that's the friendship in the Eros. I wonder how he's going to totally, because I think it's a pretty short chapter, so he might just say, it's just sex and it's just romance, but maybe not. Maybe it's something more. I don't know, but it'll be interesting to see that.
Like we talk about like finding your soulmate, and so like it's like two sides of one, like what I think it's in like Greek mythology where you say like humans originally had like 4 or 8 limbs and then you're like split and you have to find the other person that makes you whole. So it's like a state of that like permanent thing that you get from a friendship where you can permanently be who you truly are and know that this person holds love and telling you that it's okay to be who you really are.
It says it like gives you confidence to be
Yeah.
yourself. Because like, I think the example he gave was if you have to do something that's scary and you get together with 2 other cowards, it becomes less scary to do that. And if you have to do something that's like incredibly difficult and challenging, if you work together with 2 other honest, hardworking people, it instantly becomes less of a challenge. Even like psychologically.
Yeah, 2 minds are better than one.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
Yeah, that's cool, man. I never really thought about it like that. Like it's like you have the urge to like find your quote soulmate, and everyone like wants to get married. But I never really thought about that as being a prerequisite for like becoming whole.
Mm-hmm.
Like an addition to self development is finding that person who you permanently.
Well, something that's like my just like thought on that, just like the whole that premise of finding someone to like make you whole is like it seems like psychologically marriage or like coming together with a woman is like the external like psychological coming together of like masculine and feminine. It's like acted out in the world.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's where it comes from.
I think we should talk more about like the idea of like soulmates when we talk about Eros, because I did read a little bit ahead, and I would like to include some of those things in my argument about soulmates, but I want to wait until we're like discussing those things.
Yeah, that'd be yeah. I
So
would like to discuss
we
that.
should definitely put that on the slate for next week to talk about that, because I think you guys, from what I understand, you guys would probably, if I understand it correctly, would probably say that soulmates exist, and that that's like a real thing. And I don't necessarily know if I agree.
Yeah.
Yeah, I never given like a lot of thought to it, so I don't know. I don't know whether or not I would agree. But yeah, I mean, we can save that we can chalk that up for next week.
Yes, I think we should.
Well,
But anyways, sorry. Is there anything else in friendship that we want to go over before we end it?
I'm good.
I think it's just important to highlight that, in friendship is not something, like I said, there's no biological imperative. So there's, one's not dependent on the other. And so, he talks about like each man is like they're nothing but himself in the friendship. It's two, there's no like in Eros, it would be like coming together, making yourself whole. If you believe in like a soulmate, whereas here it's two distinct personalities, two distinct beings, coming together and bonding. So I think that's something that's one reason why friendship stands out as like the most spiritual of loves, the least natural of loves.
Mm.
That's a good note to end on.
Yeah.
Very cool. Well, I think we will go ahead and end it there. So thanks guys.
All right.
And I'll see you guys next week. Bye.